Welcome, my name is Terry Soul, and this video is a short introduction to the idea of relative and absolute value setting or value changes in programming. I'm using Scratch as my example here because it's a nice simple language where this sort of difference shows up. The idea is when we're dealing with the value of a variable, we have to think, it's often useful to think in terms of, is this an absolute value, not in the sense of positive or negative, but an absolute value that I want it to be, or do I want it to be a relative change in the value? For example, if you're starting a program, you generally want to set values absolutely. So if you're creating a game, you want the player to start absolutely at level 1 with 100 hit points and 0 gold. Whereas over the course of the game, you want to make relative changes. They gain 5 gold or they lose 12 hit points, but those changes are made relative to the current value of the variable. It's in many ways a pretty simple concept, but keeping it in mind as you're writing code can make a big difference, and Scratch is an excellent example of that. So I have a little program here with a dinosaur sort of running down the hallway at you, and we have both parts of the program that set this up, and so you can see my previous video on sort of initialization within programming, especially with Scratch, versus running. And so the initialization, we set up the dinosaur to be at the very back of the hallway, and that is an absolute position and an absolute size. We want the dinosaur to go to a specific position, we want them to be a specific size. And then as the program runs, we want them to get relatively bigger, and we may want to shift their position a little bit. Turns out less than you might expect. And so there's this notion of setting an absolute position or an absolute size, and then over time doing relative changes to that position and time. And thinking in those terms, do I need to set this value absolutely, or do I need to change it relative to its current value, can be very helpful in terms of writing the code. So I'm going to write the code for this in just a second, but I'll encourage you to pause the video now and see if you can do it yourself. Okay, so hopefully you just took a stab at writing our dinosaur charging down the hallway program, and maybe in the process sort of kept an eye out for those absolute versus relative changes to different variables in the program. So let me go ahead and do this. The first thing I need is the right backdrop. So I'm going to pull up my hallway backdrop. Let's see, that was indoors. There we go. So there's my hallway backdrop, and then I need my dinosaur. You can, of course, pick a different backdrop and a different sprite if you want, but these seem to work pretty well for this example. Here's my dinosaur. And so I'm going to say when the green flag is clicked, the first thing I need is the setup, the initialization. So I need my dinosaur to go to the right location, and that's going to be an absolute location. I always want my dinosaur to start in the same place. So I'll go to motion and go to, and it turns out that about -51.8 works pretty well, but of course you can change that if you want. So there we go. But I also want my dinosaur to be much smaller. So I'm going to go to looks. And here's sort of where things are important. I've got two options. I can change the size by a particular amount, or I can set the size. Changing the size is a relative change. It takes whatever the current size is and changes it. And so I could say, well, this is the size of the dinosaur right here, and I want to change it by -50 to get it small enough. The problem is when I run the program, the dinosaur is going to get really big, and then changing it by -50 might not be enough. So I don't necessarily know what the right relative change is, especially if things are happening, the dinosaur is growing or shrinking. So it's a lot better not to do the relative change, but to do the absolute change and just say, yeah, I absolutely want to start it at 10% of its initial size. And then typical for good programming, I'll run just that little piece and say, oh yeah, it shows up as a little teeny dot and looks like it's standing on the floor. That's about what I want. Now I can sort of move on. So the next piece is I'm just going to have a loop as it walks forward down the hallway. And it took me some fiddling to get the loop right, but it turns out that if we repeat about 200 times, that tended to work pretty well. And then as it loops, I want it to get bigger, maybe to move a little bit, although it turns out the movement is not so important. As the dinosaur is growing, it gives the impression, because it grows both up and down, that its feet are sort of moving down on the floor. So there's not a lot of movement that needs to take place. If you look at the image closely, it is a little sort of more to the right. And so to get the dinosaur to look like it's coming straight at us, I do want it to shift a little bit to the right as it walks down the hallway. So I'm going to go to motion. And again, I have a couple of options. I could put in a go to, but this is going to go to an absolute position. And if I repeat this 200 times, the dinosaur is just going to keep going back to the same position over and over again, which is not what I want. Instead, what I want is it to move, to change its position a little bit. I want a relative change. So it turns out changing x by, it doesn't take much, about 0.1 should be enough. So every 10 loops, it's moved over just a little bit. And so the dinosaur will look like it's coming forward, but also moving sideways. But the key here is this is a relative change. Similarly, I want it to get bigger, so I'll go down to my looks and look under, there we go, size, but I don't want to set the size to a particular value, because then each of those 200 loops, I'll just keep setting it to the same size over and over again. I want it to grow, so I want its size to change by a little bit. Let's see, and I think changing by about 0.5 worked well. I have to double check to make sure I have that right. No, let's change that by 1. So as I change it, it's going to get to be about 200 times its original size. So again, these are relative changes. They make the dinosaur get progressively bigger and shift over a little bit. I also need to put in a few other things so this doesn't happen really quickly. I'll need a little bit of a wait. And again, you might want to sort of adjust the weight to whatever makes you happy. I'll try half a second. I don't think this is going to work well. I think I've got some of the numbers reversed, but we'll see. And then I will go to the next costume so that it looks like it's walking or stomping as it comes towards us. Note, for a lot of these functions, we have this relative versus absolute option. So it's true for costumes as well. I can say I want to switch to a particular costume, but if I put that into my loop, that means it's always going to be going to the same costume. That's an absolute choice. Instead, I'm just saying go to the next costume. That's a relative choice, a relative change. Whatever costume I have now, we're switching to the next costume. So pretty typical, but not always the case. Setup is absolutes. We want to go to an absolute position and an absolute size. As the code is running, we're more likely, not always the case, but more likely to be doing relative changes. So let's go ahead and run this. And that is much, much too slow. I think I want my wait to be something more like 0.1 seconds. There we go. And now you can see it stomping forward. Interestingly enough, as I said, we don't actually have to make it move down. Just by growing, it looks like it's moving down the screen, which has the effect of having it look like it's coming closer to us. So really, that's all there is to this notion of relative changes versus absolute value settings. But it is both a simple idea, but one that's good to keep in mind. And like all sort of basic programming concepts, it shows up in every programming language. So I've illustrated it in Scratch, and it's nice because in Scratch we can see switch to costume, as I said, is an absolute change. We switch to a specific costume. Next costume is a relative change. From whatever costume we currently have, we're making a relative change. So in Scratch, you can often see those commands, the absolute version and the relative version, side by side, but they apply equally. Every programming language has this. So in something like C++, you can set a variable, x equals 7, or you can make a relative change. X equals the current value of x plus 1. So we increase it by relatively 1. Keeping that in mind can help solve lots of different programming problems for you. Excellent. Thank you.